Hello, everybody. Sorry for the little technological glitch, but it is worth the wait to welcome you to the start of our April members meeting. It's our fourth, and we hope it's our last virtual members meeting. We've had 2 Novembers and 2 Aprils, but we think things are improving. So it's my real pleasure to welcome our keynote speaker, Indra Nooyi, who, as you know, was between 2006 and 2019 CEO and chairman of PepsiCo. She's really a kind of iconic woman in the business world, in the US and the world. Her prescient strategic thinking, insight into consumer behavior, and wisdom on managing a vast global workforce has made her one of the world's most sought after advisors for entrepreneurs, executives, and governments. She's revered as a role model for women and for immigrants, and celebrated for her empowering messages on exclusivity. She was born in Madras and came to the United States in 1978 to attend the Yale School of Management. The book from which she'll be speaking, her memoir, My Life in Full, gives some very vivid stories of arriving in this country as an immigrant, although, as she says, through the front door with a visa and with some money in her pocket and with a good education back in India. She's been received many awards and is still very active in the business world. She's a director of Amazon, and she just recently joined the board of the National Gallery of Art. She was elected last year as a member of the APS. And I know she's going to talk a lot about her life in business, but in reading her memoir, there was one paragraph that jumped out at me, and I'm going to take the privilege of reading it because, and I'll tell you why. She writes, "When I was rising in PepsiCo, like many female senior executives, I was also the only woman in the room when our management team sat around debating tactics. I was always well prepared and offered good insight, and I know I was respected. But quite often when I made suggestions, someone would jump in and say, 'Oh no, Indra, that's too theoretical.' A few minutes later, a man would suggest exactly the same thing, using the same words, and be congratulated for his terrific, insightful idea. I once leaned over to a senior operating executive and loudly asked him to bring up a thought of mine, quote, 'Otherwise, it will be viewed as too theoretical,' I quipped. That ended the too theoretical comments. What grabbed me about that is that Ruth Bader Ginsburg said exactly the same thing about her life at the court when she was the only woman after Justice O'Connor retired and before Justices Sotomayor and Kagan came on the court. She was the only woman sitting around the conference table at the justice's private conference, and she would say something and nobody would pay attention to Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And one of the male justices would say the same thing and everybody would say, 'Oh, great.' So with that introduction in mind, it's my pleasure to turn the screen over to Indra Nooyi.
Thank you, Linda, for that very kind introduction. And thank you all for welcoming me into this extraordinary organization. You know, over the past few weeks, I really enjoyed learning about its rich history, including the precursor to the American Philosophical Society, the Junto Club, which was founded by Benjamin Franklin in 1727. As many of you know, Franklin proposed the club be formed of ingenious members, readers, and intellectuals. And I'm told that newcomers like me had to make a series of pledges. They had to profess a love of mankind, of any profession or religion soever. They had to reject that any person ought to be harmed in his body, name, or good for mere speculative opinions. And they had to answer one essential overriding question inspired by John Locke. Do you love truth for truth's sake? Any club that demands this of its members is one that I'm privileged to be a part of. Naturally, in the Junto Club, public speaking was also a vital ingredient. They met on Friday evenings in a place called the Indian Head Tavern. One Junto member, Nicholas Cull, wrote that the meetings were designed to inspire with bright ideas and poetic fire. It's just one of the reasons I'm looking forward to our future meetings, particularly when they can be held again in person. For now, we can take heart in imagining Ben Franklin's amazement and delight in seeing our faces and voices beamed around the globe. Back in Franklin's day, of course, things happened much slower. It took about 2.5 months for a letter from the colonies to reach London, and much longer to reach continental Europe and beyond. That would hardly change for the next century until the invention of the telegraph, when practically overnight, months were reduced to minutes. Time moves, in Ernest Hemingway's phrase, gradually, then suddenly. And we track history by these sudden disruptions. And when they happen in our own lifetimes, we look back on earlier periods in disbelief. Remember the days before cell phones and the internet, we say. Teenagers roll their eyes, just as we did when our parents mentioned life before television. But these technological disruptions often pale in comparison to far more profound cultural disruptions. When an idea, once thought radical or even far-fetched, quickly becomes widespread. All of the greatest disruptions in history have followed this path, from the abolition of slavery and child labor to women's suffrage and same-sex marriage. So tonight, I'd like to begin our annual gathering by talking about what I believe should be the next great disruption to our society: how we integrate work and family. Right now, I believe the two are in conflict, and that is bad for society and for companies. And the costs fall heaviest on women. This has been slowly changing over time, but much too slowly. I believe we can accelerate this process from gradually to suddenly, so that one day, children, and girls in particular, will look back in disbelief that there was ever a time when people were forced to choose between having a career and having children. And since the society has been at the forefront of so many advances in the way we live across all the sciences and the humanities, there can be no better place to talk about this issue. Because even though our members include some of history's greatest thinkers, Thomas Paine, John Stuart Mill, Isaiah Berlin, we have to admit that philosophers did not always get it right on family matters when they engaged at all. Socrates, as recorded in Plato's Republic, said that children ought to be possessed in common so that no parent will know his own offspring. Aristotle argued that fathers have the right to disown their sons. Rousseau, taking this advice literally, abandoned his 5 children, sending them to a foundling home. Then he wrote a treatise on the proper upbringing of children. Montaigne, for his part, was a little bit more caring. Parents, he said, may cherish and make much of their children if they deserve it. I think it's fair to say that in the history of philosophy, substantial questions of work and parenthood have been too often ignored and perhaps overlooked. The result, I think, is a lack of serious thought and serious argument about how they fit together into that great philosophical idea, the good life. So tonight, since I'm a big believer in measuring results, I will consider this talk a success if it leads even one of you to discuss the topic with your friends, families, and colleagues. Because the more that influential leaders like you bring these issues to the fore, the faster we can move. Now, the relationship between family and work is very personal to all of us. So let me begin with my own story. As Linda mentioned, I emigrated to the United States from India in 1978 at age 23 to attend Yale's New Business School. And when my career brought me to Chicago, I met a wonderful man who I have now been married to for more than 40 years. Together, we raised our 2 daughters with lots of help from family, friends, and caregivers. At the same time, I worked incredibly hard at Boston Consulting Group, at Motorola, at ABB, and at PepsiCo, and ended up leading PepsiCo for 12 years as its chairman and CEO. But when people ask me what brings me the most meaning in life, I answer the same way that most Americans do: family and work. Yet it's remarkable that conversations around the future of work still dance around the idea of family. The conversations focus instead on technology and automation, artificial intelligence, robotics, education, and skill training. I grant you all these issues are incredibly important, but what about family? Too often, family has been considered something separate from work. Well, that may have been true once, when women were expected to stay home and men were not expected to be involved in child rearing. Those days are gone. Yet the laws and norms governing the work-family relationship have largely stayed the same. And changing them is what motivated me to write a book. I was not interested in telling the traditional tale of an immigrant who arrives here with little and ends up with a lot. I wanted to write about the need for a new work-family model as someone who continually struggled with how to balance them and who didn't always get it right. My daughters and husband would be the first to tell you about it, although my mother might even beat them to the punch on this. But in writing this book, I wanted to inspire others to share their struggles mixing work and family and bring more attention to the sacrifices they've made. Because the trade-offs, the angst, and the costs that force people to choose between family and career are not set in stone. We can change them, and if we do, the benefits will be immense. So before we talk about how to integrate work and family into a new model, the solutions, let's talk about why we should do it. The stakes are very high, not only for gender equality, but mostly for economic growth. The timing of this conversation couldn't be better because it bears directly on one of the biggest challenges facing the US economy right now, the severe labor shortage. 2 years ago, Connecticut Governor Ned Lamont asked me to help lead the state's response to the COVID-19 crisis. I witnessed firsthand the economic forces that have resulted in the current labor shortage. And I've seen the pain that employers are now facing, unable to find the workers they need to run their business. There are 11 million job openings here in the US, which is putting a real drag on economic growth. And one of the biggest factors driving this problem, it turns out, is caregiving. Men have pretty much returned to their pre-pandemic labor force numbers, but women have not. A recent Census Bureau study found that there are 6.6 million people who are not working because they're caring for someone else: children and grandchildren, parents and spouses, siblings, and other family members. Most of these people, of course, are women. And women these days happen to be the exact people that employers need: energetic, creative, diverse workers who are getting more bachelor's and advanced degrees than ever, and getting them even more than men. So freeing up more of the caregivers to re-enter the paid workforce will provide a huge boost to the economy and help ease some of the inflationary pressures we face today. Unless we take action, the labor shortage is actually likely to worsen over time because the industries where job openings are growing fastest are in areas where women predominate, including healthcare and home care, and jobs of every kind that require a college degree. The question is, how do we bring more caregivers into the workforce in ways that progress from slowly to gradually? I believe this will require 3 major shifts in American life: one cultural, one corporate, and one civic. So let me talk about each of these. One of the biggest impediments to a new work-family model is also one of the most culturally entrenched: gender bias. And one of the reasons it's difficult to change is that it's difficult to talk about for all of us. Women don't like to be seen as complaining. Men often don't like to rock the boat. But open dialogue is so important. The more we share our stories and listen to one another, the more progress we can make. I know the pain of being paid less than my male counterparts which I experienced as a young executive. And I know what it's like to be talked over and interrupted. It even happened when I was chairman and CEO of a Fortune 50 company. If we want more women to remain in the workforce, it's crucial that we encourage people of all genders at all levels of seniority to call out bias when they see it. And talking about bias, one of the most pernicious forms of bias that women face is still flying under the radar of most male managers and executives. And that's the way women are judged differently than men for the family choices we make. This leads many mothers to feel conflicted about sticking with their careers when they have so many demands from their children too. In fact, when I said earlier that history's greatest thinkers have often overlooked the pressures of caregiving, perhaps that was a little unfair. Feminist philosophers like Carol Gilligan and Annette Baer have written brilliantly on the subject. Their field is now known as the ethics of care. Building on earlier ideas of justice proposed by people like Hume and Rawls, they argue that women disproportionately shoulder the burden of care and often feel a heavier responsibility than men when weighing up their obligations to society. And to be honest, throughout my career, I often felt that even as I was gaining influence and power in the corporate world, I was failing my family because I wasn't home more. I felt I was not living up to society's expectations of a mother. Looking back, I'll be honest with you, I'm a little heartbroken I spent so much energy worrying about this, because I came to realize that I was judging myself against an unfair standard, a standard that holds family over the heads of women and treats professional success of women as though it was achieved at the expense of motherhood. Women often feel that getting a promotion or prize outside the home seems to mean that we're letting our domestic duties slide. I suspect some members of this society have experienced it too. When career success is seen as shirking family duties, women often leave the workforce out of anxiety or guilt. And it's important for men to understand that and to get into the discussion and realize that when they hire people, they're not merely getting a pair of hands, the whole family comes along. So that's the cultural challenge we face, confronting bias and celebrating women's success without turning it into a judgment on motherhood where women feel they must choose between children and a career. As leaders in our field, we all have opportunities to advance those conversations. The second element in building a new family work model is changing the way we think about companies. That starts, I believe, with putting the public back in public corporations. 3 years ago, as you may recall, the Business Roundtable released a statement endorsed by 181 CEOs about corporate responsibility. It stated that CEOs were, quote, redefining the purpose of a corporation from one that benefited shareholders to one that benefited all stakeholders, including employees. It was heralded as a major development, and I was certainly glad to see it. But you know what? It was not a new idea. In fact, as the historians in our society know well, corporations are rooted in public benefits. In the early days of America, corporate charters had to be approved by government, and government only approved them if the corporation had a public purpose. It was one of this society's earliest members, John Adams, who was the driving force behind this idea. His vision was that joint stock companies would share the burden of risk and spread the rewards of enterprise. That was the trade-off for extending legal protections and privileges. Investors could reap profits, but the public had to benefit. Over time, that trade-off was lost. And in that loss lies the roots of many of the challenges we face today. I want to be honest. I'm an unabashed capitalist who believes deeply in the benefits of private enterprise. But I also believe that a company's impact on society needs to be written through all of its business planning and not as an afterthought. What's good for commerce and good for society must go together. I put that philosophy to work at PepsiCo by rethinking everything we did under a new umbrella, which we called Performance with Purpose. The idea was to link our business success more directly to the success of our employees, communities, and consumers. And I will tell you, it was not an easy lift. Many thought it odd that a modern day CEO would try so hard to move an organization beyond the idea that a company exists to make shareholders happy. I'll never forget a portfolio manager asking me incredulously, "Who do you think you are, Mother Teresa?" But the notion that a corporation is just a profit center is a relatively recent one, and it has not served companies or society well. When I was leading PepsiCo, we began looking at all our products and operations through the lens of environmental sustainability, healthier eating and drinking, and supporting and empowering our employees so that we could attract and retain the most talented people. We instituted 12 weeks of paid leave. We created on-site or near-site childcare centers for our employees. And we added private space for breastfeeding, a health pregnancy program, and offered support to expecting mothers. These things work. We saw real returns in terms of loyalty and peace of mind, and it was an incredible recruiting tool, especially the childcare, which reduced commuting time and increased productivity for both moms and dads. I know PepsiCo had the resources to do it, but while small companies may not be able to afford childcare on their own, that doesn't mean they cannot be part of a solution. We just have to think creatively. For instance, what if small companies in a region banded together and with community groups created joint childcare centers in central locations? And if we recruited retirees to help out when others were on leave as part of the paid leave program, or to participate in a broader, more multi-generational approach to taking care of kids after school. I also think we must be much more upfront in taking on one of the biggest reasons that women don't re-enter the workforce, the so-called motherhood penalty. Some of you may have paid it or seen your spouse or friends pay it. It's the penalty that women pay when they return to work after having a child. Their opportunities are somewhat restricted, and that often results over time in lower pay. This is a very well-documented phenomenon. And the fact is, it's not only mothers. Anyone who takes time off to care for a loved one, a spouse, a parent, a sibling, can get caught in a loop of bosses and colleagues who feel they're not quite as productive or committed to their jobs as the guy sitting next to them. This is one reason why millennial women in particular are choosing not to have kids or delaying childbirth. Some are accommodating this reality by freezing their eggs, putting off their decision to become mothers because the situation is so fraught. Of course, delaying motherhood to reduce career penalties is itself a penalty because it robs women of the freedom to control if and when they want to begin their families. It's critical that employers recognize this problem exists and create return ramps for women who've taken time off to care for a loved one. The motherhood penalty and the reasons for gender-based pay disparities have been getting more attention lately, and that's encouraging. But we also know that not every CEO is willing to listen. And that brings us to the third essential solution, civic change. Now, I realize there are some people who look at capitalism as something of a holy grail handed down from the heavens to Adam Smith. But to me, capitalism is more like a garden that must be tended to encourage healthy growth. Watering and fertilizing, but also mulching, weeding, and pruning to prevent and remove harmful threats that naturally arise. When we are diligent, the harvest can be abundant. But when we sit back and let nature run its course, the results can be catastrophic. When the Industrial Revolution shifted work from fields to factories, society came face to face with the free market's terrible externalities: unsafe working conditions, child labor, unsanitary food, stifling pollution. Thankfully, the progressive era saved capitalism from its excesses. And a generation later, the New Deal saved it from its failures. Policies that began as radical ideas slowly bubbled up from cities and states and went national in bursts of congressional activity. Change happened gradually, then suddenly. And what emerged was a new era of capitalism, stronger, more humane, more just, and more stable. But of course, for women, Black Americans, and many others, this new and improved version of capitalism looked an awful like the old version. It would take the civil rights movement to become wresting capitalism away from bigotry and discrimination, and that's still going on. In each era, Americans used democracy to cultivate capitalism, putting it to work for us to advance our values and goals. But one of the most remarkable aspects about women's entrance into the labor force is just how little it changed the way government views the relationship between work and family. We are still not taking the basic steps necessary to support those who want to earn a good living while also building a healthy, happy home life. In fact, since I entered the workforce, the situation has gotten more difficult because the cost of healthcare, childcare, college education, and housing have all gone up dramatically, far outpacing income growth. Some of you may have family or friends who have decided not to have children or not to have a second or third child because of these costs. And some of you may have faced this dilemma yourself. The US birth rate is falling and is now below replacement rate. That is a serious challenge for our country because stagnant population growth over time leads to a stagnating economy. It is clear to me that we need change, and I believe it should start with three crucial initiatives. First, paid parental leave. First, paid maternity and paternity leave must be mandated by the US government as soon as possible. Currently, only 1 in 5 workers receives any paid leave. Among low-income workers, it's 1 in 20. There's a long list of physical and mental health benefits to both infant and parent when they bond and heal in the weeks after birth. And that's why every other developed country has adopted paid parental leave. In fact, the US is the only developed nation in the world where paid leave for a new baby does not exist at the national level. Women who take paid leave are 93% more likely to be in the workforce 12 months after a child's birth than those that don't. And studies show that fathers who take leave are more likely to share in household responsibilities equitably over the long term and have greater empathy for family demands. In addition to young parents, those with grown children often need paid leave too. Early in my career, when my father fell ill with cancer, I was at a consulting firm, the Boston Consulting Group. In an unexpected turn, my boss kindly told me to take 6 months with pay to care for my father. I ended up only using about 3 months of that paid leave. But without that, I would have had to quit my job. Nothing could have stopped me from taking the time to care for my father. The fact is, I would not have become CEO of PepsiCo without having the benefits of 3 different types of paid leave: caring for my dad, caring for my 2 daughters when they were born, and caring for myself after a car accident when I had to recover from major injuries. If all Americans had the opportunities for paid leave, I believe our country would reap the long-term benefits in both gender equality, but more importantly, in economic productivity. The second way we can use civic action to transform the work-family relationship is to adopt universal childcare for children under 5. The average cost of childcare is $1,300 a month or $16,000 a year. That's more than the cost of attending a public university in many states and well out of reach for most families. Since most parents cannot afford to leave work, they often struggle with their duties, causing them great stress. A recent survey found that about 1 in 3 primary caregivers had been reprimanded, demoted, transferred or fired because of childcare challenges. Meanwhile, companies lose about $13 billion a year in lost productivity from the same challenges, and governments lose $7 billion a year in tax revenues. So this is not a question of whether the public should pay for childcare or not. It's a question of whether we continue paying for an unorganized childcare system in the form of lost economic activity as we are doing now, or devote our energy to thinking through smart government involvement that will make families healthier and our economies stronger. To me, it's a no-brainer. Now, the third major civic action needed to transform the work-family relationship is providing more flexibility and predictability in working hours and locations. Workday should be organized around productivity, not just time and place. And for all the tragedy that COVID has wrought, there has also been a silver lining, because it has moved corporate acceptance of more flexible schedules from gradually to suddenly. This has been an enormous step forward for white-collar workers. And now we need to take a similar step for shift workers by providing them with more predictability in their schedules. The lack of predictable hours is extremely hard to manage for parents and other caregivers and leads some to drop out of the workforce. A study of retail workers at Gap stores found that when they were given predictable hours, not only were the workers happier, they actually sold more clothes. Sales in those stores went up 7%. It is a powerful example of what happens when we recognize that employees have family members who count on them. Achieving these three ideas, paid leave, universal childcare, and more flexible and predictable work schedules, will require all of us to take action. And that means voting and advocating and supporting candidates who understand the importance of harmonizing work and family. This is the spade work of cultivating capitalism. And as we plant new seeds, we can pull out the old weeds that block healthy growth. For example, old weeds like zoning restrictions and other housing regulations that are preventing multiple generations from living under one roof. That's a good example of how strengthening family support systems does not always require more government intervention. Sometimes it requires less. And combining the two missions creates the possibility of bipartisan compromise. I truly believe that by working together for civic, cultural, and corporate change, we can create a citizen-centered capitalism that integrates the two areas of life where we all find the greatest meaning, our families and our work. The more we all push, the faster we can reach that tipping point where change moves from gradually to suddenly, not 6 generations from now, but in our own lifetimes, so that we will be able to see the look of amazement on the faces of our grandchildren when we tell them about the old days when families were not valued and supported in the workplace. And we know it can be done because this society has helped bend the arc of history so many times before. In the Declaration of Independence, one of our early members placed equality at the heart of this new nation by writing that all men are created equal. Every generation is called to extend the definition of equality more broadly and more fully. That is the beauty and brilliance of America. And it is a great honor to be a member of a society that has helped lead the way forward for nearly 3 centuries. I want to thank you again for joining the session, and I look forward to meeting you all in person. Good night.
Indra, thank you so much. I'm trying to start my video, but I hope I can be heard. Thank you so much for that. Here I come. Right. Thank you so much for that talk. And to show you how much it resonated with many of us, I'm going to read from the chat a note left by Mary Claire King, who is one of the country's most valued and most noted cancer researchers. And she says as following: please give my congratulations and thanks to Indra Nooyi for the excellent presentation. It resonates with me at every point. I must leave early now in order to pick up the child of a young colleague at daycare because she, the colleague, has a late clinic. These issues don't have an age limit. Very best to everyone, and see you tomorrow. So really, I thank you. And I was going to ask you, I'm going to start off with questions, and people should put their questions in the Q&A function. I was going to ask you about the impact of COVID, and you addressed it toward the end of your talk. So let me ask you a maybe more personal question. At what point in your rise to the top in your career did you feel, or would you have felt, or should you have felt comfortable in articulating the message that you gave us tonight? How many times did you have to sort of bite your tongue and just go along with the system? And at what point were you liberated enough to actually say something?
I think we have to come to a tipping point. For a long time in my rise in the corporate world, I was the only woman in many cases. There are very, very few women at my level, and women were just entering the workforce in large numbers, especially in mainstream companies like ours. And so once we had a critical mass of women, and we found that they were not staying in the workforce, but about the second or third level leaving to have families, we realized we have a problem. We love families, we love children because they're our future consumers. At the same time, we also love the brilliant brains that these women represent. And we wanted to tap into the entire workforce, not just a portion of the workforce. And so we realized that we had to create a company where people could bring their whole self to work, that somehow they could have a genuine balance between work and family. And when we opened the first on-site childcare in our corporate headquarters, and so quickly filled up, employees paid for it, but it filled up so quickly. And the emotion and the joy on the faces of parents that they could now, actually have children in their place of work in a wonderfully managed childcare center and continue to work, it was worth all the effort of putting it in. So I think when you have a critical mass of people who need these services, you can talk about it more openly.
Your construct of from gradually to suddenly, the kind of critical mass, I thought was very,
exactly right,
very gripping, and I think that's one thing that the pandemic has accomplished. It's impossible to think of ever going back to. I mean, I like you grew up in a very traditional corporate culture where you had to be there, or you needed an awfully good reason why you weren't there, and a good reason was not for childcare purposes. And I cannot imagine that we'd ever go back to that. Let me turn to the questions. Here's Mary Beth Norton, a very distinguished historian in our company, and she says, "Me too." About 2 years ago, it happened about 2 years ago. Oh, I think she's referring to being talked over, and then the man gets the credit for the idea that you articulated. Me too. About 2 years ago, an American Historical Association committee meeting when I was the president. Okay. A question from Sally Warren. Do you believe corporations should contribute to community-based childcare if they have workers who use their services?
I think corporations, community organizations, state governments, federal government should all come together and look at this as an economic issue, a human issue, and not look at it strictly as a political ping pong, because that's not what it is. I think if we look at it through the eyes of young family builders, through the eyes of the children that we need for the country, through the eyes of women who are going through incredible stress, and look at it as a really human issue, there isn't an issue when we come together as a group that we cannot address, Linda. Remember, we put a man on the moon and brought him back safely. So I'm convinced that if we brought the right people, we will get to the right solution. But if we keep punting this issue saying family is female, let the women figure it out, I don't think it's going to work.
Here's a question from our member, wait, I just lost here. Howard Gardner, who observes, unfortunately, the tipping point in Congress and the Supreme Court is now in the opposite direction. Do you have political advice?
I am totally non-political, so I have zero political advice because I don't even know how politics works anymore. So I think many of you who are steeped in politics need to sort this out. But the only thing I would observe, if this was a corporation and we had people with differing points of view, we'd find the opinion leaders who are sensible and bring them together and say, let's talk about this human issue. Not at all frame it. I don't care who gets the credit. And that's perhaps the difference between a business and politics. In business, we don't care who gets the credit. We just want the outcome to be good.
Caroline Bruzelius says, surely it's essential that there be more women in government and in a position to legislate the changes you suggest. But the challenge is that because of the absence of family support, it's much harder for a woman to take on a legislative position, especially at the national level. It's perhaps a chicken and egg problem. Without structural support, how can women take on the challenges of political roles?
Again, it is a chicken and egg problem. I think we've got to find states which are run by governors who believe in childcare and really support family builders. And I want to broaden the definition to family builders because sometimes, men are also equal participants in helping to build a family. So I think from those states, we ought to elect more women because there are more support structures in those states. And I honestly believe governors should be looking at childcare, creating environment for all family builders to participate in the paid economy. They should view those as competitive advantages and use that as a selling point to attract people to the state.
Kimberly Tercy says, thank you so much for speaking on this issue. I'm a third-year undergraduate at Temple University, Philadelphia, and I was wondering if you had any advice for young women navigating the workforce and balancing work and family early in their careers when the business environment has not yet caught up.
First of all, because of all the technology, you can balance work and family better than we were able to, because we had no technology. We had to travel to every place, or there was no remote connecting technologies. So in my life, it was about juggling work and family, hoping that I don't drop any of the priorities. Today, with all of these technologies, you can cut back travel, you can do things more remotely, you can keep in touch with your kids constantly. So you have the technology tools. In fact, I'd go so far as to say, Linda, that in 2 years, all the technologies we're seeing today are going to look old because so much has come in that takes virtual reality to a whole new level. So we might be sitting at home participating in a conference where we actually feel we're touching and feeling people next to us. And so I think there's more hope for people to balance work and family with technology. The only thing I fear is the following. What I don't want is two classes of citizens being created, those that go into the office and those that work from home. What might happen in that case is more women work flexibly from home while the men go to work. And what you'll end up with is a two-class society where the people who come in are viewed as more committed, more culture carriers, and therefore they get elevated while a lot of the women are left behind. So again, it's early days. We have to see how this all shakes out. But deep down inside, I have that fear.
Well, we're gonna wrap up our session with that, but I certainly agree with the number of comments I didn't read because they weren't questions. But I think your words resonate with a great many of us, and especially those of us who have daughters managing their own balancing acts. And so thank you so much. And I hope you and everybody on this call Zooms in more smoothly, I hope, tomorrow afternoon at 1 o'clock when we start our first full day, second day. And we thank you and we welcome you warmly to the APS.
Thank you, Linda. It's a privilege to be part of APS.
And good night to everybody.
Thank you.